Hi, welcome to the Early Childhood Voices 2022 conference. My name's Melinda Brooker and I'm a PhD candidate at Sturt University. So today I'm going to talk about followership and following practices in early childhood education. So the aim of this qualitative study was to investigate followership by illuminating the followership practices of early childhood educators in both the followership and leadership positions. And this was conducted in one for-profit long day care, a not-for-profit long day care, and one preschool setting in Australia in 2021. So the research design was a practice approach package. So within this package were theory, methods, and ways of representing the practices in text. So the theory I used was through the lens of followership. I use methods of multi-site ethnography and the theory of practice architectures to interrogate those ontological understandings of followership. And then I use the theory of practice architectures to frame the findings by the sayings, doings, and relatings of practices. So there were 26 early childhood educators that participated in this study. Data generation methods used was shadowing participants as they went about their routine day, asking questions on the fly. After the shadowing sessions had finished, I conducted 9 debrief interviews with educators. I also used a reflective journal, and then I used a collection of relevant artifacts. So, for example, some of the artifacts were government policy documents. So the research questions are: how do early childhood educators follow in early childhood education contexts? And how do the workplace rules influence the enactment of followership practices in early childhood settings? So before I share some of my findings, I wanted to briefly introduce the concept of followership, as you're probably wondering why anyone would want to study followership. So I'll ask you, how many of you grew up wanting to be the best follower you could be? So of course we don't aspire to be a follower, as the term follower is surrounded by negativity. So who remembers being told by a parent, if everyone else jumped off a cliff, would you? We grew up being called out for following. However, what is the only thing a leader would absolutely need? And the answer, of course, is a follower. So if no one is following, then no one is actually leading. You cannot have one without the other. So it makes no sense to privilege your leadership and ignore followership. So follower is not something to be avoided. It's a legitimate, necessary role, because sometimes in the workplace we lead and sometimes we follow. So why does it matter? So as you can see with Tony Stark's comment here, following is not really my style. And, in popular culture, society views leaders as heroes. And as James Mendel coined the phrase romance of leadership to explain this assumption. So he says, romance of leadership is when leadership and leaders themselves are idealized as heroic images of leaders, and it becomes a part of our collective consciousness rather than what is actually unfolding and happening in front of us. So in general, exploring followership challenges that prevailing heroic assumption of leadership being responsible for motivating and influencing followers. So it matters in early childhood education because if you think about it, followers make up most of the workforce compared to positionally assigned leaders. That's leaders with a leadership title like manager or director. So positional leaders in ECE are also increasingly burdened with responsibility to achieve quality outcomes. And that includes motivating educators to use best practices when working with young children. So to illuminate followership, I first looked at the traditional view of followership. So followers in this traditional view are usually recipients of a leadership's influence. So as this figure shows, it's a downward influence. Looking at the dictionary definition, it says that followership is the capacity or willingness to follow a leader. However, as I found, followership's much more complex. So for this study, I viewed followerships through 2 broad categories. So on the left-hand side there, it's called role-based followership, where you reverse the lens to see how leaders are recipients of followers' influence rather just than focusing on the other way around. So, for example, think about educators that you work with that haven't got that leadership title, but they're still self-motivated. They seem to intuitively know what to do without asking. How would they influence leadership and workplace outcomes? Another example is educators that work with a less than ideal leader, but they're still motivated to achieve effective outcomes for children. So these examples show that these followers or individuals are not passive recipients. So over on the right-hand side is another category called co-constructionist model. So this focuses on the more relational and social processes. So the patterns of influence that co-produce those workplace outcomes. So this definition holds that being influenced doesn't necessarily mean passivity. So followers, whether in a followership role or following as a practice, can be actively involved and accountable and sometimes courageous. Educators in this study did not actually view it under these two models. So predominantly the narrative in the early childhood settings were that followers stood back and had to be told what to do. So as you can see in this cartoon, this was the predominant narrative. Educators stood back. Educators have to wait for leaders to tell them what to do. But what they told me was different to what I viewed in practice, because as I use followership practices as a unit of analysis, the standing back narrative was not what was viewed. So overall, followership practices range from passive, obedient, all the way up to proactive, despite that predominantly negative assumption. I discussed how the three themes I've selected here show alignment to the role-based and co-constructionist followership approaches. However, the context of early childhood education in itself added that extra layer of complexity. So I'll just give you a brief background. So the first theme was following children. During an interview, I asked Ella how she identified followership. She gave a different response. So she said, in terms of following, she followed children in order to meet those pedagogical goals. So she said, I'm not going to force them to do something they don't want to do. That's the children. Because I'm here to help them and give them confidence, not make them who I want them to be. So Ella was influenced by the leadership goals and the workplace philosophy, which was to meet children's needs and using best practice pedagogical goals. So she explained she was a follower in terms of following children. The next theme is self-governed followers. So this is when educators are influenced by government mandates. So during an interview, Dana, who's a float educator, she relieves people during their breaks and planning time. She reflected that the feeling of following was instinctual in terms of conducting observations of children's learning. So she told me, I think it's just a feeling. That was what the requirement. I don't think it was highly spoken about, but when you see all the others sort of sitting there doing it, that is the paperwork, monkey see, monkey do, you sort of follow suit, that sort of thing. The third theme was naive followership. So Jade was a kindergarten teacher and she undertook practicum at a long daycare. So she was telling me about how the educators were placing young children in timeout when they weren't listening to a story. So she was telling me they were sitting them in the corner for like 5 minutes at a time. And children at 2 don't understand what they're doing after 5 minutes. They don't know why they're sitting there. So she questioned the educators as to why they would do that when they obviously seemed like they did not enjoy that practice. And the educators in this workplace explained to her that it was a leadership directive. Management had told them this was the behaviour management policy and this was what they were meant to be doing. So even though they disagreed with the practice, they continued to use that practice, but they displaced that responsibility. They put that responsibility onto the leader. So I coined the term naive followership to indicate that why they would continue to work in a way that they disagreed with. So looking a bit closer at theme 1, following children. So educators ceded leadership to children in the central pedagogical purpose to meet leadership and workplace objectives. So they understood followership as the need to educate children through play. So the practices that were observed, the actions were proactive, they were exemplary in the sense that they used their initiative and they took ownership of those practices. They did not need leadership to tell them how to do it. It was, they went about it in a responsible manner. And the ways of relating were lots of patterns of influence with children. There was a lot of ceding power to children. So in other words, the children had the power, and educators followed the children's needs to meet the organisational purpose, the leadership purpose. So that theme here is inconsistent with the organisational management literature. There's no mention of children in that literature. So those co-constructionist definitions, they sort of say that followers should be actively engaged with leaders to advance the mutual goals, which was what was happening here when educators were following children. So theme 2 is that self-governed followers. So in this instant, they were governed by the Australian Children's Education and Care Quality Authority, aka ACEQA. So ACEQA outlines 7 quality standards which are monitored by authorised officers who assess services against those 7 standards. So educators predominantly took a passive followership role in this instance. So their followership sayings and understandings were sort of orientated towards those beliefs about authorities, and it impacted the way they followed. So the actions were compliant, monkey see, monkey do. And their ways of relating were mainly to cede power to ACEQA in order to meet those paperwork, that documenting children's learning requirement. So I just wanted to note that in one site, the educators were quite complex with how much paperwork the educators were actually doing. And they said that they wanted the educators to spend more time with the children rather than doing paperwork. So this surfaces that narrative that this directive did not come directly from their management, so that what you would call close leaders. So ACEQA was a distant leadership kind of entity that seemed to have more influence on the educators' practices. So theme 3 is naive followership. So educators sometimes granted leadership to unethical leadership directives. So this placed their understanding under that romance of leadership category, not wanting to step on the leader's toe because of that assumption that leaders are all powerful. So the actions that occurred under that theme were that displacement of responsibility, so they were obedient. And then the ways of relating were following the leadership directives despite disagreeing. So it's important to note that this theme was conveyed by an anecdote that Jade shared with me. So it's just one example of an unethical leadership directive that can be followed by educators. So Mendel, who coined romance of leadership, he suggests that when we view leadership as the mitigating factor for success, we're unwittingly overlooking what the leader actually does, and that the power followers have to mitigate that unethical directive, but they're unaware that they have the power to do so. So finally, the implications. So this Dilbert cartoon provides a summary of the implications and the understandings of followership, although it's a little bit tongue-in-cheek. You see the leader there saying, I'm too busy to take a leadership class, so I'm sending you all to a followership class. And someone sort of says, is that so we can learn how to follow someone that never learned how to lead? And then the leader saying, that sounds like a question for the followership teacher. So it's a bit tongue-in-cheek, but it sort of gives you an example of the have increased understandings of followership in early childhood education could be that potential avenue for relieving the leadership burden, and also illuminating ways educators willingly ceded power to ACEQA as that government authority. We need to change that narrative and maybe change it to followership being resistant and being more creative in how we balance those paperwork tasks instead of being self-governed rule followers. Thanks for listening. Have a great day.